Good morning, South Africa, and welcome to Kagiso Trust webinar. It is a bit cold today in Gauteng, where COVID-19 is raging. And I hope that we all remain safely within our commitment to find a way of strengthening our society's resilience, not only to cope with COVID, but many other social challenges, including poverty and inequality. The webinar is around exploring the civil society resilience and how do we think we can strengthen the sector in order to play its critical role. We have a whole number of speakers, and I'm going to try to be very economic with time. My name is Buichoko Ditlake. I'm the program manager for Civil Society Support Program in Kagiso Trust. And I believe that we all have the program, have received the program, and we will try to follow the program as it stands and seeing how it goes. Without taking much time, I am going to invite the chairperson of Kagiso Trust to give us an opening remarks. Memang Godin Tsaba is the chairperson of Kagiso Trust, and I know many of you knows her, and we don't have to spend much time in introducing her. Madam, you are welcome. Thank you.
Oh, yes, thank you very much, Buichoko. Am I audible?
Very audible.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank you all for accepting our invitation and setting aside time to be part of this webinar as we explore the challenges facing our country and seeking ways of strengthening civil society to play a more effective role in addressing the needs of our communities. Kagiso Trust is convening this webinar in recognition of the important role that civil society plays. And this is confirmed by our recent studies, which we will be sharing during this webinar. And two of these studies are Typologies of Civil Society in South Africa, which was published in 2019. And another one is the Community and Civil Society Resilience Survey during COVID-19 lockdown, which was published in 2020. The lessons from these studies revealed a civil society sector that is highly responsive to the needs of the most vulnerable components of our society, a civil society that can leverage scarce resources such as people and finance within a short space of time. The study also showed that COVID-19 pandemic has catalyzed a transformational agency for sustainable change to restructure and tackle underlying and enduring fault lines of inequity, which we all know about in South Africa, social injustice, and all other fault lines that undermine the development of our society. The studies have also revealed not just the vulnerabilities of our societies, but also the opportunities to bravely renovate and remodel policy and program interventions, which I believe are urgent in terms of facilitating development via civil society. The studies also have identified key intervention areas, some of which will be interrogated and tested and discussed today. What are our objectives for today? It is really to share the learnings, reflections, insights, and recommendations from the studies to help us as a collective to strengthen the civil society sector to play a critical role. I am sure as we go along today, we will have all sorts of ideas that will ultimately help us reach those objectives. Secondly, we have also invited experts in the sector to share their analysis of the current situation as it impacts on civil society, on the sector, and what needs to be done going forward. We also are going to explore civil society's shared thinking, collaboration, and coordination of our collective efforts towards the transformation of South African state. the transformation of society and the transformation of the economy to ensure a shared and equitable development. And fourthly, we wish to strengthen our strategic partnerships with the state towards the aspirations of our constitution and commitments of the National Development Plan. We also acknowledge that so much has happened since the advent of our 1994 democratic elections, to mention a few which must find solutions over the coming period. We have to pay attention to quite a number of things, remembering that this year, in this month, June, it's Youth Month, and the 45th anniversary of the Soweto, June 16th. And we are celebrating this within the backdrop of increasing unemployment at levels of 32% as reported by Stats SA. And when you look at that unemployment and you include what is described as discouraged job seekers, that rate increases to 43%. And, you know, underlining the severity of the situation is now what we call the youth unemployment. The youth unemployment rate of 63%. It's really a worry that all of us must attend to. And then we have another problem, which is gender-based violence. And it is a national scourge and a pandemic. According to the United Nations Population Fund, we are told that 1 in 3 women throughout the world have experienced physical or sexualized violence in their lifetime. 1 in 3. And what is being described in that 1 in 3 does not include emotional, financial, or verbal abuse. Now you can imagine if we include emotional, financial, and verbal abuse, that 1 in 3 probably becomes 2 in 3 in terms of gender violence. And then we have to also address ourselves to another problem, which is corruption, a societal cancer that must be eradicated. We know that from the Zondo Commission, it has been revealed that over 15 billion has either been stolen or misappropriated only during the COVID-19 crisis alone. State capture and corruption have over the years depleted the state capacity to provide services for most of its citizens through the weakening of institutions of governance and government. Now, we should be asking ourselves, how can we contribute towards rebuilding of what was originally the developmental state of South Africa? Getting to our education system is still another problem. It remains largely untransformed along racial lines, along racial disparities between the rural and the urban. We saw during the pandemic when the children had to study from home, the digital divide that really meant our rural poor children could not access education. Looking at the state of the NPO sector, which is doing so much with so little or almost nothing and largely unsupported, and given the many challenges it faces, we really have to operate outside the box and ensure a resilient, effective, and sustainable sector to underscore its significance in building resilient communities and holding our government to account. I think we need to underline that, holding government to account. Looking into the future, there is a need at all levels to keep hoping and working towards social change and building a better life for our communities, ensuring inclusive, just, and equal society. And I strongly believe that the NPO sector is well positioned to make a contribution there. To come to my conclusion, Kagiso Trust is committed to play a catalytic and facilitative role towards achieving these aspirations, which are driven by a strong, coordinated, and resilient civil sector through collaborative partnerships. I am looking forward to the outcomes of this webinar to enrich our common purpose and inform our responses going forward. I really wish to thank you all for participating in this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mema Nkone. Thank you very much, Memankone. You have laid the foundation and the key issues that we need to grapple with. And I indeed hope, and given the representation that we have in this webinar, that we will indeed achieve those objectives. Without taking much time, let me take the webinar through the schedule that we are going to follow throughout this morning. I am going to invite the participants to participate in the Menti Meter, which is a tool that we are going to use to ensure that there is an ongoing interaction and reflection and how we understand the sector as it stands today and what we think needs to happen. And the Menti Meter as a tool is based on a simple question that we are going to ask immediately just after here, which we will be able to tap in throughout the webinar until after lunch, when we will announce the results. And the question for the Menti Meter is, how do we reclaim civil society space, which is known as innovative and very responsive? And how do we sustain its resilience? We are requested to fill that question, to respond to that question throughout up until 11 o'clock, and we will announce the result, the key observations. Secondly, the following are the guidelines for the discussions as we go along. Meman Zaba has outlined the objectives of the webinar, and I'm not going to repeat them so eloquently. We have about 5 speakers who have different times allocated to them. After each speaker, we will have 4 questions, which we will consider both from the chat box, but also allow people to speak. And then we will have 2 questions from the facilitator, which is myself. And the speaker will respond to all of the questions, including the last 2. That will be the framework of the meeting, which will happen after each and every speaker. And then after that, we will go into the Menti Meter announcements in terms of the results. And then we will have a plenary session or open discussion for about 45 minutes, which will enable us to go through what has been presented before us as civil society and what we think it needs to be done going forward. We will conclude by summarizing the key points which has emerged, which we can broadly summarize as a plan of action, which we are going to interact with each other over the next 5 years and beyond. And then we will have the closing remarks. That will be the layout of the webinar and from now until the end. We have about 5 speakers, as we have said. And I'm going to start by inviting Mr. Peter Nesipale, who is the Deputy Director General of the Department of Social Development. And I know many in civil society knows Mr. Nesipale very well. I was in one of the International Day of the NGO sector some time ago, where I listened to his analysis. He is currently the Deputy Director General for the Community Development in the Department of Social Development. And he has a long history starting in the health sector. And having worked until the position of the Chief Director within the Department of Health. And then he joined the Department of Social Development in 2009 as the Chief Director for the Npo Registration and Compliance Monitoring. He clearly understands the sector. as he is, as I've indicated, is currently the Deputy Director General for Community Development, and he have a number of qualifications, which I'm not going to repeat all of them. One, including the postgraduate diploma in public management and a master's degree in business administration. And we will share some of these things in our report. Welcome, Mr. Netsipale. Kagiso Trust is indeed indebted for your acceptance of our invitation. As the Department of Social Development is the custodian of the Npo sector. Thank you very much, and we are welcome. The podium is yours.
Thank you very much, the chairperson of the proceedings today. Thanks very much for invitation for us to share our the department's plan and experience with the non-profits in the non-profit sector. My presentation is long, but I will make sure that I don't follow step by step of the presentation. And mine is, I'm going to be providing you with the structured engagement framework. As you're aware that I'm in the department, I'm government. The flaws and the failures, you can blame us from this side, but we are together in this. My presentation is as follows. We have got the purpose until the conclusions in terms of what I'm going to be providing. The whole purpose of us sharing this today is to begin to provide some insight on how, as a department, but maybe let me say, as a regulator for the non-profit sector, we intend to strengthen the collaboration without taking the self-regulation, independence of the non-profit sector in the country. We are aware that the non-profit organizations plays a very significant role, and I think historically you realize that we also gain our democracy through some of the non-profit organizations that were taking the lead in ensuring that they talk on our behalf and they defend democracy and shun away the apartheid. But that doesn't withstand the constraints that once that we are in a democracy and we have got a regulations or a policy, and we have got an Npr sector that are currently faced with a lot of constraints. And I think some of the challenges relates to what the country is experiencing. But we find that these NPOs, from where I sit, are diverse in their constituencies in terms of their function, size, and in terms of the form, scope, and what they do. But the majority of the NPOs are within the rural areas and in the low-lying areas of the country and are poor. And they are at current due to COVID, which has worsened the situations. Some are collapsing, some don't have, the donors have dried out. So those are some of the things that we're experiencing from this side. In order for us as a sector to address the issue of NPOs, and together, I think with Kagiso Trust and others, we need active involvement of the NPO itself. And I think one of the things that I'm going to put forward is that after this, we need to come up with what strategies do we need to use to ensure that the issues of self-regulations, consultations, and for the sector to take lead in their own engagement and the collaborations are we going to put in place to ensure that that is in place. So the department where we stand, it was given this mandate, the legislative mandate, the NPO Act was promulgated, signed by Nelson Mandela, our first president in 1997. And that act mandated the Department of Social Development. In actual fact, it's not supposed to be the Department of Social Development. It's supposed to be a regulator like what is happening in other countries, a regulator for the Npo sector, because when it's in government, in the department, it's like it's a services for social development, whereas it's supposed to be a services for the country. So the directorate was established that provide the registration facility and the other regulatory matters within the system. And I won't go to this one, but I need to share with you here the Npo register. We are standing today, as of the 31st of March, 242,000 Npo registered in the system. The majority of them are voluntary associations. The Act prescribed to, remember, the registration is in terms of the Bill of Rights, Section 18, freedom of association, that the country as a whole put together and ensure that whoever wants to associate can be legalized to become an Npo, but comes with responsibility and accountability. So the majority of them are volunteer association, followed by the non-profit companies, NPC, and then the trust also registered as a non-profit organization to get what you call public benefit status. You also have to register with SARS for that public benefit status and not to pay tax. The provincial distribution, the majority of the NPOs are, we find them in Gauteng and followed by KwaZulu-Natal, Western Cape. I don't know is whether they are following the money, the gold, and the fee that we have, and the list is in Northern Cape, and I think it's in terms of the population that we have. I'm not reading some of the things down. The non-compliance and others is not for this meeting, but this is that you need to have. That's one of the challenges that we have with the NPOs. The percentage distribution of the NPOs, 32% is in Gauteng and the 2% is in Northern Cape. The registration is in terms of the UN classifications. The majority of the NPOs that are registered is social services. That include ECD, older persons, VP, etc., 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 followed by development and housing, and religion on the other side. Churches do register as a non-profit organization. Some churches, because remember, registration is voluntary. Some churches do register, some don't. And then the list is on the issue of environment and law advocacy and politics. So these are the distribution of the NPO in the country, and this is distribution of the registered in a tabular format, and registration per type in terms of the registration. Now, the current NPO registration. Now, as a department, we have got a role that we need to play. The role that we need to play is that as a regulator for the sector, we need to ensure that the policy development and the legislative framework is reviewed time and again. We need to ensure that the Act prescribes that we need to provide codes of good practice and governance for NPO. We need to ensure that there is, each department has got a funding policy, and ensure that there's education awareness and also engagement. The engagement between government and the NPO sector has been varied, but the Act prescribes that the government or any state must ensure that there is governed, regulated engagement between the state and the sector. As a department, we developed a partnership model. We have got code of good practice. We have got consultations. But one of the things that we begin to look at was to begin to ensure that we have got an engagement framework that the regulator needs to deal with. The rationale for that was to ensure that as a custodian of the NPO Act, we need to create an enabling environment as the Act prescribed. And we have got a responsibility to ensure that programs and support are provided to the non-profit sector. And we also have to ensure that the NPO itself are responsible, accountable, and are operating in good faith. So the NPO sector engagement framework seeks to create a platform for the sector to take lead to dialogue on pertinent issues that affect them. And I think that needs all of us, all the civil society to come together and deal with that, and not necessarily government to lead. So these are some of the aims and objectives of the NPO engagement framework that we have. But the main aim is that we need to create an opportunity for NPO sector and any other interest party to seek solution to the sector, so that the sector should be seen to be supported, environment created, or we sweep the floor for the sector to be able to flourish and do as they wish, do as they planned in the country, and also ensure that there is a lot of consultation, a lot of talk. When you go to other countries, you find that the NPO sector really lead in terms of issues of poverty alleviation, unemployment, development, awareness campaign, and meet government halfway in terms of doing what they're doing in their jurisdiction area. And of course, with the support that we can have from government for service delivery and for any other advocacy work that they have. The framework has got 5 key principles of engagement, and which I think I won't go through them, but what are we, this is a document that you can read. But these are the 5 steps of NPO engagement model that one need to have. Engagement principles looks at thinking strategically, analyze and plan, resource and prepare, design and engage, and review the measures. But the main aim is that this framework, engagement framework that we have developed it. We need to put up in the open so that we can discuss. And I think this is the beginning of that which Kagiso Trust have done, that we need to deal with it. And we need to appoint champions of those, because a document can be a document, it can lie in the shelves, but we need to appoint champions where non-profit sector can organize themselves and say, these are the champions. Then as government or as a regulator, we will be able to ensure that that is done. I won't go to step by step to all in these areas, but I think these are some of the NPO sector engagement levels and method, and also the priorities that we have, that we need to prioritize the learning, sharing, and innovation, and so that we are able to support that from the regulator point of view, from the department or from government, and the promotion of good governance. Some of the NPOs are not really behaving, but we will make sure that when we implement this framework, this is part and parcel of things. You have seen in my stats that some of them are not reporting. Conducive NPO policy environment is one of the priorities that we need to look at. Partnership and collaboration. We have got a model. The model is short-sighted. I think we will, this year, we have put in our MTSF to develop a broader civil society partnership model that will say, how do we collaborate? How do we partner? And also, lastly, the issues of capacity enhancement. A lot of NPOs, we register about 1,000 and 1,500 NPOs per month. So you will find that a lot of NPO are coming in. Some of them, they come in because they think there's money that must be done, that they must get, but they forget their obligations and responsibility. So I think one of the things is that we will need in the engagement framework, we need to make sure that we outline those. We have I can outline that we have, as part of the framework, have what you call a mentorship. We say, Kagiso Trust, take these 150 NPOs, can you mentor them so that they become one of the best NPOs that we have? The NPO sector engagement management outlines how this will be managed and how it will be done, whose responsibility it will be. And I think this will be, together with the sector, we will be able to identify and ensure that we do it appropriately. So these are some of the factors that hinders effective engagement. And I think it's more than that. I think those are some of the things that we have seen, that why is there no engagement between government and the non-profit sector, or between the NPO sector and business, or and donors, or amongst themselves. But then we also tabled some of the things that we need to take cognizance of. The success of this engagement framework rely on some of these enabling factors that we have, e.g. resources, commitment, coordination, and also transparency, accountability by all sectors, and adherence to set principles, and patience on the other side. And as the wheel is moving, we must make sure that these are, and I think you might have seen that we said COVID have destroyed a lot of things and have cut short things. NPOs are closing down due to resources that we have. But I think in this engagement, we'll be able to come up with how we can mobilize resources from everywhere so that the sector is well looked after, so that they can do. One of the stories about these resources issues is that NPOs are there 24/7. They are available at all the times, and they are within communities. They know what they are supposed to do. So they could be an implementing arm, a service delivery instrument for government to be able to do a lot of things much faster and cheaper, not because you are getting less paid, but because of your capabilities and the skills that you have. So the outcomes of the NPO sector engagement, we anticipate that it will also enhance the relationship and the collaboration between government and the NPO sector itself. It will create a vibrant and empowered and a resilient NPO sector that are capable of dealing with all obstacles amicably. It will increase understanding and knowledge base for the NPO sector. And also, it will also increase level of commitment and ownership, both sides, from the NPO sector and from the government as a whole, and also it will ensure that we come up with other innovations, we learn from each other. So, in conclusion, the work of the NPO sector in a humanitarian and a charity work is very important, as it assists the society to achieve our development goal in the country. And it also makes sure that they become the eyes and the ears of community itself. We have seen a lot of good things that are done by the NPO sector. But this requires commitment by both government and the sector as a whole. Even business, we have roped in some business to come in, and we were looking at areas like about Nikela and others to say we need to begin to avail resources and to make sure that we touch base on that. It is on this basis that all concerned parties should come together and have a meaningful engagement that will translate into action and improve the current condition that we find in the NPO sector itself, and also sector engagement processes. As we begin the consultation, we will need every sector, every civil society to be part and parcel of this, so that we can have an engagement framework that will be beneficial to all, and we deal with the issues that we have in the country, which is unemployment, poverty, inequality, service delivery, even COVID as we have now. We were looking for volunteers to deal with the older persons over 60 registration and for vaccination. One of the first things that I told the minister was the Npo sector has got people that can do that work. Together we can be able to do it if we engage properly, and we hope that this engagement framework of the department and the NPOs will become one of the best tools that we can use. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Netsipale. I think it has been a very comprehensive presentation, the basis of which we should be able to discern what are the key emerging issues. Among others is the capacity of and the meaning of the self-regulation of the sector. And you have highlighted some of the key challenges, including the capacity to dialogue and engage, and how the sector can reorganize itself to be able to lead in some of these processes. More significantly is an issue of the resourcing of the sector and some of the strategic considerations that it can be explored going forward as a collective. I am going to allow questions. I'm not sure, Mr. Netsipale, you already see you have access to the charts and to the Q&A. There are a number of questions that already, some of them before you even started, but they happen to link in what your presentation was. One of the questions that have arisen is what is DSD doing in terms of vaccinating the teachers and practitioners in the ACD sector? If the department is doing anything in that regard. One of the questions is what is the DSD doing in supporting the Npo sector in the far-flung areas, especially in the rural areas? If the DSD has connections with the Npo sector in the rural areas. And also a question, and I'm sure that Mr. Netsipale can I have access to some of those key questions. At the Q&A, there is one critical question as to what do you think is the role of the Npo sector in the 21st century? And how much is the annual budget of the Npo sector? These are some of the key questions that are coming, and I hope we have noted them. Let me open for 5-10 minutes to get if there are questions from the participants that are clearly directed to you so that we can respond to them. You can see the charts, ne?
I can see the chart, I can see the questions, and I don't know, you want me to go to answer these questions?
Yeah, just briefly to respond to some of these questions.
Yeah, no, I think it's very good questions that I have. The first one is about the budget for Npo sector. Remember, I think we must distinguish between regulation, the regulator, and the funder. But yeah, because, and I think I've raised these issues earlier as a start, that the Npo Act was given DSD to implement. In actual fact, it was not supposed to be DSD. It was supposed to be outside a department because we can't be a referee and a player. We register all NPOs in the country. For health, for you might have seen that nice diagram, for health, whatever. Now, each department determines its policy on how it will fund its NPOs. Is there in the Act. The Minister of Social Development, in collaboration with Minister of Finance and other government ministers, will determine what, how they will fund the sector. So it is not in the regulator's responsibility to determine the funding at all. We register and make sure that people are legal entity and they are registered and they follow the law. They are accountable and they are not criminals and other things like that. So that's what we do. So we don't determine how much it must be paid, but each department, each state department have to take responsibility for that. However, we monitor which one is funded and which one is not funded. Secondly, the NPOs is a must that we must have NPOs. It's very important. And I think this government, this democratic government, I think you need to really say thanks very much for the founding part of our democracy, the Constitution. It is a must that we need to have as NPO sector so that it is entrenching Section 18 of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Freedom of association and to be licensed to be an organization in good standing. And we need that. And they do a lot of work. You will find when you are in one area, you will need people to be a group of people that has got things that they need to do for the community, for themselves, and to ensure that there is emancipation of the communities there. The issue of registration and the rural areas is something that we have been looking at. We didn't want to open it up because we have been attacked very much. Certificate has been fraudulently done and whatever. So our aim is that in each and every province, there is a Department of Social Development that provide that service, advisory service, assisting people in the rural areas if they want to register. For example, there is a program that falls under my branch, which is called Community Social and Community Mobilization. We go into an area and do household profiling in order to tackle poverty, unemployment, and other issues. We then get the number of people that are there per household, and we find a lot of things. It is through that you will realize that they will say, we want to form an organization. Then they will be assisted to form an organization. So in this time and age, we even rural areas has got internet, and if it's for registration, you can register online. You can do anything through via the net, and you will get a certificate sent to you through that. The issue of regulator and the player. By regulator, we mean that in other countries, we went to Kenya, they've got a regulator as an entity outside government, but that report to one of the department. It regulates it registers and monitor compliance to the regulations. We go to the UK, they've got UK Commission, it does that. The reasons that we need to be like that, it is that you are able to police government departments freely because you are outside and you are able to say which department is not complying to that, rather than just register NPOs and send compliance and letters. But you do that. But we are at the moment, we are at the process of making the NPO registration directorate a regulator outside the government as an entity. It must be cheap, of course. And we are hoping that we will have offices in all 9 provinces so that the issue of engagement is done appropriately, and a dedicated staff that will do all things that I think we mentioned. Resources, yes, resources is a challenge, we are aware, but we have spoken to a lot of people recently, businesses and others, that they need to begin to fund the non-profit sector in their own area. Donors, we know there's not, the donations is very low, but we have been requesting that we need, the funding has been only for service delivery. But what we want, there are areas where there is no funding, advocacy, awareness campaign, issue of the capacity building, those areas are not funded. So we are looking at some of the sectors to begin to leverage some resources to fund the non-profit organization. I've mentioned something which is called the Mentorship Program, which is part of capacity building. We want to empower the Npo sector, that we have 1 to 100. One NPO that is well, like Kagiso Trust, look after 100 NPOs and look at all what they're doing and their compliances, but also educating them, but also talking back to us as government in terms of their needs, in terms of what they need to do. We won't do handouts. They need to innovate. We found that in one area of Kenya, they were an NGO that has got a huge land. They start tilling the land and selling what comes from the land, and they had a lot of money. We need to begin to be like that. It can't be an NPO that is waiting for handouts. There should be some innovation, some economic empowerment that they need to do, and so that whatever comes to them is an addition to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Netsipale. I see those were the overall questions, and because we are going to have a later 45 minutes of discussions, we'll be able to revisit some of the key issues that you have raised, and there is an active chat in the chat box and the Q&A, but we have summarized some of the key questions which are there. Just the last wrap up from myself. In a summary of all your presentation and listening from the participants' questions, what do you think is the key focus area that you think the Department of Social Development should start engaging and working with the sector to address? The most key important one, and secondly, what do you think will be the best approach to addressing that particular issue?
From the regulator's point of view, this is not only one important key area, but I think the most key important area that one need to look from where I sit is engagement between government and the civil society organization. Robust one, where we need to develop a compact on what we need to do. We must talk. We must be together. And the best approach of doing that is that as a sector, we must begin to organize things like this that we are having today much more robustly, so that we can outline a lot of challenges. There's a lot of challenges that are there in the sector, but I will think this engagement in this fashion throughout, not only once, but development of a social compact between NPOs and the government is one of the best ones that we could do. And you will realize that compact doesn't have only one focus. It focuses on a lot of things that we can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Netsipale. We appreciate, and I think we will continue to engage. We will also share the presentation that you have made. And because we are going to revisit some of the things that you have presented in a short while. I would like to remind participants that if you go to the chat box, you will see a link to respond to the Menti Meter question that we talked about earlier. Please continue, because that will be one of the key areas that we need to consider going forward. As we have said, the key question that we need to address through the Menti Meter is, how do we reclaim civil society space as an innovative and responsive sector? And how do we sustain its resilience? You'll see the link in your chat box in order to respond to that question, because it will underline some of the key outcomes that we will need to consider going forward. Thank you very much. At this point, I would like to invite Mr. Joel Netsitenze, who is the Executive Director and the Vice Chairperson of the Board of Governors of the Mapungue Institute for Strategic Reflection, otherwise known as MISTRA. And equally, I think we all know Mr. Netsitenze, who worked in the presidency for a very long time, since the time of Nelson Mandela, up until when he retired as the CEO of the government communication systems. And most of us, we know his critique, that he has been reflecting on some of the key issues that are taking place in the country, and especially in the ANC, and he himself is in the executive committee of the African National Congress. And he's in various boards that I'm not going to go through. Some of these details we will put in the report for reflection. And indeed, we appreciate your acceptance of our invitation to share your perspective in one of the key areas that Mapungue has been working on. Among others is the compact, but also the developmental state, and how civil society can play a key role in some of these key processes, and perhaps taking a step forward some of the key issues that Mr. Netsipale has been raising. I would like to invite Mr. Netsitenze. Welcome, and the podium is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Program Director, representatives of government, Nedlak, and other dignitaries, and fellow participants. I should thank you for the opportunity to take part in this webinar and echo the sentiment that Kagiso Trust should be congratulated for this initiative against the backdrop of multiple crises that are facing the country and broader global society. The temptation is to focus on state and private sector initiatives to manage the COVID-19 pandemic and instigate economic reconstruction and recovery. Civil society gets ignored as that pesky third sector of society, which revels in narrow sectoral and issue-based campaigns. I'm certain that those who have had the opportunity to go through the Trust's latest papers will agree on the depth and insights that are in those offerings. They speak to the sector's societal utility, even under the most difficult conditions. The point of today's discussion, I suppose, is not about developing strict definitions of civil society. One proceeds from the assumption that we are all agreed that this refers to the collective of bodies and activities outside of government, party politics, and business. In the context of today's discussion, it seems that we need to narrow that definition even further, with emphasis on those referred to in Nedlak as the community sector. I was asked to reflect on state and civil society compact, building a developmental civil society. And I will do so proceeding from that conceptual understanding. The starting point in this regard is that political power finds expression in control over resources, formal institutions of government represented by the executive, the legislatures, and the judiciary, and what Antonio Gramsci referred to as cultural hegemony, around which societal consent is framed. Civil society nestles largely in the category of cultural hegemony, while it interacts with the domains of economic and political power. It is a critical and autonomous expression of societal consent or dissent. And consent is fundamental to the legitimacy of any polity. In the absence of this, the only other route would be repression, or to use the irony in Bertolt Brecht's poem, The Solution, when the people have forfeited the confidence of government, would it not be easier for government to dissolve the people and elect another? What then is the ideological and organizing framework of South African society in the democratic era? We can refer to the many noble injunctions in the Constitution about democracy and the various generations of human rights. In compacting terms, the starting premise of the settlement of the 1990s was the political compact, premised on the understanding that the political leadership would counsel patience on the part of the marginalized and engender a preparedness to contribute to restitution by the privileged. Over the years, stability has been maintained because of general progress in improving people's quality of life. Obviously, not all citizens have been reached by these changes, but two critical currencies have helped to sustain social stability. And these are hope and trust. Hope that the progress in the neighboring village would reach our own, and trust that the state is intent on progressively realizing people's social rights and has got the capacity to do so. There have been many reversals on this journey, and the overall progress on economic equity has not been edifying. The levels of unemployment, especially amongst youth and women, the maldistribution of wealth and income, the horrific pictures of sewage flowing in the streets of many settlements load shedding, the instances of rampant corruption, and many other ills. All these underline the levels of social anomie in our country. Quite clearly, the current economic, social, and health challenges constitute a profound crisis which can imperil our polity in its entirety. The fundamental question is whether the leaders of all the social partners perceive of this as sufficient of a burning platform to nudge South Africa towards a social compact of higher rates of growth and development. In the past decade, the need for social compacting arose sharply in relation to specific turning points. In 2012, we seemed to have found a eureka moment with the adoption of the National Development Plan, embraced by all parties in Parliament, as well as most of civil society. During the middle of the past decade, the emergence into the public domain of the shameful acts of state capture galvanized large sections of society in a campaign to defend democracy and demand accountability. At the end of the decade, after the 2017 ANC National Conference, there was euphoria around the hope of self-correction and societal renewal, combined with social compacting efforts through the jobs and investment summits and other such initiatives. However, by early 2020, we were experiencing the second technical economic recession in 2 years, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. For us to be able to forge a state and civil society compact and build a developmental civil society, we need to understand why the post-2017 efforts at social compacting floundered. Why didn't they move the dial on economic growth and job creation? It can be argued that turning around an economy does take time, especially against the backdrop of years of mismanagement. But the failure of these initiatives was also due to the tendency to focus on detail with a long list of actions rather than the most fundamental principles. We thus need what I would refer to as coalescence around essence as the starting premise of a national social compact, and indeed one between the state and civil society. We are all familiar with the evolution of civil society post-1994. This, in my view, can broadly be characterized into various phases of emphasis. There was the period of mass migration of senior civil society activists into the state and other centers of societal power. Among the remaining activists, a paradigm of oppositionism took root, with political elites seen as people intent on doing bad. In this period and beyond, important campaigns were undertaken on workers' rights, the direction of macroeconomic policy, as well as health and other social issues, gender rights, and so on, with many victories and defeats along the way. Added to these are the quiet but important efforts in community welfare projects. In the last decade, the broad front against state capture was one of the high points of South Africa's civil society. In my view, the outcome at the Nasrec conference would not have been possible without that intervention by civil society. Post-Nasrec, there is growing appreciation that for society to renew itself and for resistance against accountability to be defeated, civil society should, in the same breath, critique and support the state. I've ventured into this rather crude and truncated characterization to emphasize what I believe is a critical point. And this is about the continuum in the operation of civil society. From oppositional activism based on critique and protest to facilitative activism, which takes the form of encouragement, and activism of critical support to combine cooperation and contestation. In this regard, civil society has used mass organization and mobilization, the legal route, formal platforms of engagement with the state and business, and developmental projects. In the context of all this, we cannot ignore the tendency among some elements within civil society to view their activism as a form of transit station on the way to formal party politics, with many from, for instance, the Feast Must Fall campaign, trade unions, and local service delivery protests transiting into politics in the legislatures across the spheres. Handled opportunistically, this can encourage flesh in the pen radicalism, which is more about showboating. Yet, if handled properly, such transitions can help invigorate formal politics and the corporate sector by injecting new thinking and a new culture. In the context of this continuum in activism, what should be the pillar of a social compact? How should the notion of a developmental civil society manifest itself in actual practice? To answer this question, we need what was referred to earlier as coalescence around essence. This includes an understanding of the fundamental issues in the global domain. Like other countries, we have to navigate changing power balances with real and contrived tensions in many parts of the world. As a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, developing countries are experiencing a devastating slump, and there is now a two-speed recovery in which they will lag far behind. Progress in reducing poverty has been reversed by at least 3 years, and according to Oxfam, in 2020, 32 of the world's largest companies saw their profits jump by about $100 billion more, and the net worth of billionaires has skyrocketed with 1 billionaire added every 17 hours last year. So sustainable has this become that the IMF itself is calling for the rich to pay for the recovery efforts, partly through wealth and windfall taxes. It is also arguing that in the current situation, governments should avoid undue focus on budget deficits. It would seem that a new Washington consensus is in the making. Now, these global issues are important in their own right, but they assume critical importance also because South Africa is the world's social laboratory on issues of class, race, and gender. It therefore follows that social compacting in our situation should have at its core two main issues. For a start, we need to have a common approach on the character of the social system that we seek to build. In the typology of capitalisms, we have the neoliberal Anglo-Saxon model, social democratic welfare states, and the Southeast Asia developmental model, amongst others. South Africa, I think, needs a combination of a developmental state that leads all of society in pursuing consistently high rates of growth and social democracy underpinned by comprehensive redistributive measures. This should be the foundational premise of a social compact. The second and related element is about the objective of socio-economic policy. The National Development Plan calls for a decent standard of living for all, which would include many things from employment to basic services, a clean environment, and so on. This concept about the level below which no citizen should sink needs to be agreed on as a national objective and as part of social compacting. For there to be a meaningful and lasting social compact, the state itself should be developmental in orientation. And so, among the areas of focus for civil society should be to campaign for a state that has the ability to develop a vision and has the capacity and the legitimacy to lead in its implementation. Among others, this requires a developmental pact with public sector unions. The Reconstruction and Recovery Plan adopted last year should be understood in this broad context. As to whether the plan would take us to the targets set out in Vision 2030 is a matter that should engage civil society's mind, and it should take part in monitoring and evaluating implementation. This is the organizing framework around which civil society should define its role and work towards a social compact with the state and other social partners. Of course, the most urgent tasks under current conditions would include to managing the COVID-19 pandemic and ensuring that we extricate society from the current rut. There are many issues in the plan on which civil society should more intensely apply its mind. For purposes of illustration, let us identify a few of these. On job creation, many public employment programs have been initiated with focus on youth and women. Is civil society monitoring these projects and ensuring that the intended beneficiaries are able to access them? On small and micro enterprises, there were efforts during higher levels of COVID-19 in terms of lockdowns to register these micro enterprises in the municipalities and provide support. And many of them are run by women. How can civil society improve the implementation of this program? On energy generation, there are many initiatives to manage the crisis. And of course, much more needs to be done. But shouldn't civil society be more active in protecting electricity infrastructure in the communities and in ensuring payment for electricity used beyond free basic services? And if the free basic electricity program is not being properly implemented, how do we correct this? On basic education, besides the commendable campaign by Section 27, as well as the work in the ECD sector, many would agree that Kagiso Trust's Beas Node Schools Development Program has contributed to improving performance where it is being implemented. The question is whether this partnership can be applied across the board on a national scale. On informal settlements, how far has the initiative about reblocking gone, and what role can civil society play in ensuring collaborative implementation with communities? Then there is the matter of land and the rights of people in communal areas, recently brought into sharp focus by the Ingonyama Trust and other judgments. The level of social dislocation in many communities calls for focused campaigns around the state of the family, the challenge of drugs, and provision of social welfare services in partnership between civil society and the state. Lastly, we need mass mobilization around COVID-19 non-pharmaceutical interventions and the vaccination program. All these and other areas require joint and varied actions by a developmental civil society and other social partners. Of course, Nedlak can play an even more important role in this regard. The question is, do we need equivalent institutions at provincial level? And is civil society mobilizing communities to ensure that there is citizen participation in such formal structures as ward committees, community police forums, and the processes around integrated development plans? In conclusion, I wish to identify two existential matters critical to the sustenance of our polity. The first one is about accountability in relation to state capture and the resistance from those who want to bring down the temple with all of us inside. Is civil society mobilized to support state institutions in dealing with this challenge? The second one is about finding the appropriate balance between sectoral interests and common objectives. Strategic acumen implies an appreciation that, as in the public sector and the SABC and elsewhere, social compacting also requires compromise and sacrifice. 36 years ago, in 1985, when progressive sections within the religious community adopted the Kairos document. They characterized that period as a dangerous time, but also a moment of grace and opportunity. Thus was liberation theology entrenched in our campaigns. What is required today is developmental theology, and more broadly, a developmental civil society in the context of an emergent developmental state. In this way, we shall not so much build back better from the devastation of COVID-19, but build forward differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Joel. I think the key feature that Joel is raising is that we go back to the drawing boards, reappreciate the nature, the character, and the balance of forces, but also appreciate the challenges that have evolved since 1994. What informs them and how do we understand them? And then to be able to recharacterize our roles and responsibilities as civil society. What kind of a grounded theory that will then inform us to be able to reorganize ourselves. But in doing so, he says, we also need to understand the character of the states, its strength and limitations, as well as opportunities, but also internally what kind of tools, theoretical grounding, so that when we say we want a developmental state, what exactly is the kind of the state, what are its key elements that should guide us, but equally to ourselves, what kind of civil society can we reconstruct in order to navigate that essential transformational social compacting and the related capacities. Thank you very much. What I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to the Q&A. There are some of the very critical questions that are emerging there. I will start with one that is was raised by Philip Mechanic, and I suspect he's from Makana, because I suspect I met him there. He is saying there's been a lot of activism in Makana, including a petition which was signed to dissolve the council, but the government refused. Then what becomes the role of civil society? Should it be dissolved? I think you appreciate that context, including the court case in Makana that instructed the dissolution of the council itself, which was brought by civil society. The second question is from Nomvula Dlamini in Cape Town. What exactly does Joel mean by a developmental civil society? And counterpose that towards the concluding remarks, I remember, Joel, we were talking about even a developmental theology. Perhaps a very brief coining of what exactly are the key elements and expectation of a developmental civil society, which might differ from what we have today. And given the context that we have mapped out. Philip comes again and say, sometimes it is correct that the government gets lost in a lot of details and misses some of the key delivery challenges along the way. And perhaps the question there is, how do we remedy this in the context of the proposition of a developmental civil society within the context of a social compacting by all social partners? Another question is from Petron. I'm sure she's in Durban. Pat, she's saying, if we want a developmental civil society, what should be the relationship of the Npo sector and civil society sector structured in the way we have already heard about? And that means from what was presented by Mr. Netsipale from DSD in the context of the registration. But also she's saying what should be in that context the connection with the independent social movements. For example, grassroots movements like Sheikh Dwellers International, Abahlali Basem John Dolo. I hope we all remember and know these social movements, and the unemployed people's movement. And finally, two last questions will be that perhaps the approach of social compacting is for the government to come to civil society rather than the other way of civil society always struggling and requesting the government to engage and interact with it. There is an anonymous one which says, Joel, where do we start when so much needs attention so that we are not overwhelmed and given the state of capacity of the civil society itself? Those were the questions from Q&A, and from the chat. They are not, I think those from the chat are having. Oh, it's just a question again. But the question was posed to the participants to say, what do we think of developmental society? Any thoughts? I think that was, but it links to the one which was raised earlier on. Well, while we are, before you answer these questions, I would like to put you two questions after you have considered some of the questions. One of them will be, given the state and some of the questions that have been raised and what you have said, what would you consider to be the most critical issue for the rallying of civil society's ability to social compact? And secondly, related to that, what would be the building blocks of that process of a strengthened civil society to social compact? How should it go about doing that? Joel?
Thank you for the questions. I will try to be as brief as possible, in part because the questions are not easy to respond to. With regard to Makhanda and the protest, I think all of us will agree that the crisis that is being experienced there is first and foremost a crisis of local leadership. A crisis that derives from the failure of the elected leadership in that council to meet the aspirations of the community. And so the question arises, to what extent have the formal structures, such as ward committees and IDPs and other such platforms, succeeded or failed? Secondly, how do we ensure engagement, in my understanding of the situation, with the provincial government to ensure that the technical issues that they are arguing in order to appeal the judgment do not block the immediate need to resolve the challenges that are being experienced there in Makhanda. For all this to be dragged on and on without the people's problems being solved, I think it's a critical, or rather, it's a disappointing approach on the part of the leadership, both at local and provincial level. On developmental civil society, the point that one is making is that the starting point should be to understand the environment in which we are operating as distinct from the pre-1994 environment. As I was saying, even post-1994, you require a continuum in terms of the activities of civil society, protest and challenging, but also facilitative actions and developmental activities. And these developmental activities would range from developmental projects. One can refer to the many things that NPOs are doing. That's an important contribution to development, but also critically for all of civil society to pose the question, what are the major developmental programs that are being undertaken by government, and what is the role that we can play in that regard? You will remember I listed a few things from the Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, and I think civil society needs to go through the plan and answer the question, in relation to this particular issue, this is the contribution that we can make. And one also needs to emphasize that in social compacting, you have benefits that derive from that. You also have contributions that each of the partners should make, but also something that is not very pleasant. In any social compacting, there will also be need for sacrifice by all the partners. In terms of relationship in the various structures, my understanding is that Nedlak has got an important role to play. The question is whether representation of civil society needs to be improved in Nedlak, and I suppose the executive director will address that question. And with regard to social compacting and government taking the initiative, I think the saying would be truer under all conditions, that rights are not given, they are won through action, and therefore civil society must claim its place and role in all the forums that matter. How do we avoid being overwhelmed? I think the most important thing is to pose the question, where are we? What is our role? What contribution can we make? And step by step, what are the things that we need to prioritize? And how do we ensure division of labor amongst ourselves as civil society organizations? What is a developmental society? I would argue is the one that is defined in the Constitution, the generations of human rights, and progressive realization of socio-economic liberties. And of course, the objectives set out in the National Development Plan, as well as in the Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, should define that developmental society. What are the most critical issues? I'm tempted to say that it's everything that I've referred to, but I would say, if I were to identify three of them, firstly, it's the ability and the steps taken by civil society to conceptualize the environment within which it is operating and the role and interventions it should make, so that everything that we do is systematic. Secondly, as I was saying, to identify in the reconstruction and recovery plan to which civil society has agreed, the contribution that civil society can make. And lastly, a very active campaign around COVID-19 in terms of non-pharmaceutical interventions and the vaccination campaign. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, I think you have given us an in-depth food for thought and a great number of issues here to ponder as we reorganize ourselves in order to respond to the state of the nation as it exists today and the aspirations of what South Africa or the kind of South Africa we all want. Thank you very much. There was a last question, but I'm not going to pose it. I think it will come. I think Sibongile will respond to that as well when she does her presentation on the youth. And then we will rediscuss it during the plenary. Just reminding colleagues to remember the Menti Meter, because some of the dialogues which are taking place also we can post on the Centimeter. But also let us continue to dialogue on the chat box and the Q&A so that we do not miss anything, because this is a starting point, this is a basis. We are all going to live with each other over the next 5 years and beyond and respond to the kind of questions and challenges which have been posed to us. I then would like to move to the third speaker, which is Lisa Siftel. And I also know that most of us knows Lisa Siftel very well. And some of us will remember her from our earlier times in the labor movement. She is Executive Director of Nedlak, the National Economic and Development and Labor Council. And I'm not going to go at length about her previous background. What is critical for us at this point in time is the connection between what Mr. Netsipale has indicated, what Joel has vehemently underscored in terms of the developmental role, social compacting, and the in-depth role of civil society in the reconstruction and development of our country and policy making. Lisa, once again, and I know that you, and especially as Nedlak, is going through some key challenges. I must say, Nedlak has lost their colleague last night, and we appreciate the commitment and strength that Lisa has made it to share with us, because she equally values the role that civil society can play given the state of the nation now. And Lisa will be looking at what we call the contribution of civil society in the Nedlak architecture. Thank you very much, Lisa. The stage is yours.
Thanks, Chairperson. And thank you to Kagiso for inviting me to speak at such an important platform. And let me also greet the fellow speakers as well as the participants that have come here from civil society. I think I should also start by paying tribute to the role that civil society has played. I think particularly in relationship to the recent period of this very tragic COVID pandemic. And the second point I think I must also start with or preface is that I'm well aware that I'm coming to this civil society forum on behalf of Nedlak, while the civil society in Nedlak, if I looked at the participants, I think there's only one person from that grouping in this meeting today. But I intend to talk about the role of civil society in Nedlak and not about the community constituency in Nedlak. Just to start off by indicating what I would see as the role of Nedlak in the current context. And actually, it's quite different from the role that Nedlak was meant to play in 1994 and may have played over the past 25 years. I think what we have tried to do, the social partners in Nedlak, particularly over, the ED of Mr. talked about the period post-2017, where there have been greater attempts to forge social compacts, if not a single social compact. So we have tried to coordinate social partners' responses to critical socioeconomic issues. We have been involved in negotiating formal consensus-based agreements. So, for example, there was a social compact on Eskom to support Eskom in the context of the energy crisis negotiated last year. We facilitate engagement and negotiations on proposed policy and legislation, and that's really what the Act required us to do. Increasingly, and we have conducted information sharing sessions and social dialogues on critical issues, for example, the future of work, where it's really about enhancing the dialogue and engagement than reaching agreements. And then this issue, which was also referred to by Joel, around tracking and monitoring implementation, and to be able to hold social partners accountable, as also to facilitate collaboration and coordination. Although it is a little bit contested, I think business, labor, and the community constituency see it as an important role, while government feel that, that's what Parliament is meant to do. So there is some contestation about it, but I think it is an important role. And then there is a role around resolving socioeconomic disputes. So maybe just to look at the origins of civil society in Nedlak, I think Nedlak is a legacy institution, part of the democratic dividend of 1994. And some of us may recall in the drafting of the Reconstruction and Development Program, it was done by the Tripartite Alliance, and then there was plus SANCO. Also, the development of Nedlak was influenced by the International Labour Organization, which is a tripartite body of business, labor, and government, but went beyond the tripartism. And I think also was influenced by international experience around social dialogue at the time, but again, it went beyond that. And in fact, Nedlak is one of the few international organizations which goes beyond consultation to joint decision-making. And out of that, there is in Nedlak a declaration, an act, and a constitution. Now, what does the Nedlak Act say about, well, it talks about community and development interests. I think the notion of civil society was not so prominent in 1994. But at that time, there was a minister with our portfolio in the Office of the President responsible for the RDP, and it was agreed that that organization should nominate organizations of civil society, and then the minister would take these nominations to cabinet, and cabinet would appoint them. One of the issues about Nedlak, and it was raised earlier also, is that Nedlak attempts to represent national interests, and many as civil society organizations have very strong local focuses, and there's a question there about how that's balanced. Would need to have a direct interest in reconstruction and development and are constituted democratically, and then, as I indicated, would be appointed by the president. In our constitution, so in the Nedlak, there are run by an executive council, which consists of 18 members per constituency, including a community constituency. I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but I suppose to point out that there are parts of our constitution which actually are not properly implemented. So when an organization ceases to function or provide as terms that constituted by law, I have to say they remain members of Nedlak. The other thing that the Constitution does, and it's a source of tension within the community constituency, is that the community constituency is only represented in the development chamber, while chambers like labor market, public finance, trade and industry, they're not there. And the community constituency argue that they also have important interests and should be represented in all the chambers. I should also say that there's a, I don't know what to call it, let me call it, I want to use the word interesting development, but I think it's more than an interesting development, is that in line with the changing nature of work and the changing trends in unionization, informal workers are represented, in fact, by Pat Horn is in this meeting, and I think including an organization called WeGo, from the community constituency. And organized labor do not necessarily are able or have an organization that represents informal workers in Nedlak. So you can see that the lines are not always as clear as they may have been in 1994. So, as I said, I don't really think I can speak for the community constituency, but just to indicate that at the moment, the current membership is on the list on the left-hand side: disabled people, Financial Sector Campaign, SANCO, Youth Council, Women's National Coalition, and Cooperative, and WeGo, as I referred to earlier on. And then I think many of you do know that when COVID started, there was an attempt between a Nedlak Community Trust, which represents these organizations, plus SANEC Civil Society Forum, which also represents quite a lot of civil society organizations, to come together and to facilitate partnership and responses. And they are registered as a non-profit organization. So now you'll see that I'm moving from the Nedlak branded presentation to a more generic brand. Because what I really want to say now is more my own thoughts, obviously influenced by my colleagues and my experience in Nedlak. Because the question that I asked to speak about what should be the role of civil society at Nedlak, and I want to use the vaccine analogy. So we say that we're in a vaccine-constrained environment in South Africa. Hopefully this will change. And why do we say that? And there is an important debate amongst progressives about, beyond that, around, it's because of vaccine nationalism. It's because there's gatekeeping by the more rich and powerful, and that's why we see the high numbers of people vaccinated in places like the USA and the UK. However, the WHO says that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And this is really the situation that I think we face in Nedlak. In Nedlak, we are in a civil society constrained environment. And why is it? Is there a sense of Nedlak nationalism? I'll leave that as a question. And as other people have said outside of Nedlak, that there's gatekeeping for insiders. But the bottom line for me, and I think as we've seen in the experience, particularly the COVID pandemic, that social dialogue can only be enriched for both the insiders and the outsiders if there is more diversity, more representation, and inclusivity. So why then the hesitancy? So let's continue with the vaccine analogy. On the vaccine front, personally, I think there's a big question why we have got 6 million people over 60 and I think 2.6 million have registered. And is it poor communication? Is it genuine fears? Is it poverty? Is it the lack of mobilization, the inability for old people to get access to sites? I'm not sure. And it talks to you know, one of the priorities that Joel talked about at the end. But nevertheless, what we have seen, and internationally, particularly at the moment, is that as the vaccine program rolls out, it demonstrates its value, reduced deaths and illness, and a move back to normalization. And more people are ready to take the jab. And, you know, in Nedlak, I think we have hesitancy from insiders, and you know, I think also from outsiders. You can call it oppositionality, you know, skepticism. Why? The vested interest on the inside, and as Joel talked about, a trust deficit. But I thought the survey was really useful. I think one of the points in the survey, it's not exact quote, is that there was a strong view, if I looked at the figures, that organizations would like to see government engage them more, be more accountable in respect to policy formation, and use their grassroots knowledge and expertise to help focus needs and fast-track services. And I think really that is a very good description of what civil society can bring into Nedlak. You know, I think in the same way that if more civil society came into Nedlak, that it can also be the same virtuous circle and hesitancy can be reduced. So then, and why is this? What is to gain? I think these are applehood and apple whatever and apple pie issues about why the country will gain, and I thought we heard about it also in the previous speakers, but also how civil society can gain. Now, you know, I see, you know, in Chairperson, in opening, you talked a lot about resilience and that being a hallmark of civil society. Now, government, especially the post-2017, Cyril Ramaphosa's government likes to talk about, what do they call it, agility and flexibility. And so I think, yes, resilience is critical in our environment. Flexibility and agility is also important. But for me, it's about something that we did so well in the anti-apartheid struggle, was being able to manage with different instruments in our orchestra. I don't know, I can't remember what we called it, strategy and tactics and so on. But I think that if there are more instruments in the mobilization orchestra, there is increased ability to create harmonies. And again, I've quoted one of the recommendations from the Kagiso Trust report, that greater empowerment for participation and voice in social sector. I don't even remember what, but I think it's reinforcing what I'm saying. Yes, there are risks of disharmony. Yes, there are risks of corruption. And yes, there is always a tension between coming to a forum with your immediate interest or maybe your vested interest and being able to speak with and for the common interest. But I think for all of us who've been on these journeys towards developmental state and anti-apartheid and so on, there were always risks. Risks are not something to be avoided, they are to be mitigated in government speak. So lastly, going forward, I think for many years in Nedlak, the shortcomings in the community representation has been acknowledged. Both, as I indicated earlier on, the extent to which they do participate in Nedlak, that they're like regarded as second-class citizens in Nedlak, as well as the representation of greater representation of civil society. Since 2017, there's been a governance task team with the intention of making Nedlak fit for purpose and amending both the Act and the Constitution. There are proposals currently before the Nedlak governance structures. In fact, we're having a big workshop on Friday. And when there are amendments to the Nedlak Act, it won't only come to Nedlak, there will also need to be a broader process of public comments. So to some extent, this recommendation that I found in the report is already being implemented. But I think just to conclude, one of the experiences of the last 18 months or so is that, and as I showed you, what Nedlak does today is not what's in the Nedlak Act anymore. But it's not in defiance of the Nedlak Act. It's in line with the intention of social partnership and social compacting. So, and I do think that the current community constituency it has not stopped them from becoming more equal participants in most socioeconomic issues. And that relates to the contribution that they've been able to make in the general interest. And so it also should not stop community organizations outside of Nedlak of engaging on becoming members of Nedlak. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I think you have outlined a great space to allude how civil society can play its part in Nedlak, also demonstrating the connection between what was raised earlier on in order for the creation of a space that is engaging, inclusive, and participatory. And I think that is the key issue that we will have to deal with. There are questions that have already been posed to you, which were relating to exactly what you have just said. I would like, because there are many questions, we will try to answer all of them as we go along beyond today. One question from Kirsten Person is that, unfortunately, what occurs at Nedlak is very much opaque to civil society. Civil society is frozen out on the outside and does not know what goes on at Nedlak. Are there any steps underway to address this lack of transparency? That is the first question. I think some of the questions are generally, there is another question from Glenn Farrett, which relates to Nedlak, saying that given this truth, the challenges that have been raised, what is Nedlak going to do? The effectiveness of social compacting requires accountability and transparency of the decisions and with regards to the decision makers, not merely diversity and inclusion. How is this going to be achieved? I think those are some of the key summation, and I think all the questions are more or less reinforcing each other. From the chart, there are no specific questions to yourself. Yeah, thank you. Just to conclude these two questions, Lisa, one will be, given your experience and what you have just summarized and considering the questions that which have been posed, what do you think will be the key entry point for civil society broadly in making and participating and being involved in Nedlak? And what do you think would be the process or framework of enabling that entry point? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And thanks for these questions. They're quite long. Let me try and engage them. So the issue is about, is Nedlak very much opaque and civil society being frozen out? So look, Nedlak is a public entity. We have our work comes out in an annual report, we report to Parliament. So I don't think there is much that is opaque in Nedlak's activities. I can say I could relate to the fact that civil society feels frozen out. And I suppose it talks a bit to the question that the chairperson raised. Because I think it's a combination of, yes, there are the legal limits, but as I indicated earlier on, the legal limits are not immutable barriers. We are trying to do amendments, but there are ways in which, despite these legal amendments, there can be greater representation through engagement and consensus building. There is a process. The starting point is the Nedlak direct myself, and then an engagement with the community constituency. So if civil society organizations would want to come into Nedlak, I think that, there's opportunities to start that engagement in the short term. And then, as I said, towards the medium term, we are looking at legislative amendments. The question by Glenn, I think the first one I've answered. I think the issue of social compact and requiring accountability transparencies is absolutely true. And yes, not merely diversity and inclusion. And I think, as I indicated earlier on, the Nedlak processes are transparent to the partners and to the public in general. Accountability is quite contested, as I explained. But again, accountability is a bit like trust. It's got to be built in process. It's not something that you can just hammer a nail in and say, we've got accountability. So it's part of the struggle of being involved in these forums. And sometimes the struggles are quite intense, but rather engage with it than say, Nedlak doesn't hold government to account, therefore we're not going to engage in Nedlak. I hope I'm responding appropriately. And then I think your last issue, if traders are not clear and if implementation is achieved, then policy makings are failed. And you're right. And I think one of the problems in some of the, particularly, can we say, summits, job summits, it's not all of them, is that while there has been agreement on certain things, often there's agreement, I think, as Joel pointed out earlier on too many things. And you lose the essence of the, there's an inability for the essence to coalesce. One of the things that I think marked the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Action Plan, which was what was negotiated in Nedlak, was a very strong focus on trying to identify priorities. And I won't say we completely achieved it, but I think there was movement to articulate trade-offs. It is a bit in the public domain. We are now negotiating in Nedlak a liquor social compact. It's not easy. And one of the reasons why it's not easy is because I think there is still a reluctance to explicitly pinpoint and confront the trade-off that is required to get agreement on the relationship between liquor restrictions and the COVID pandemic. So again, trade-offs are a work in progress. They're not easy. But I do think a little bit also, as Joel was saying, that, we've been shook up by the COVID pandemic, and areas where there was no need to have a tight consensus has become more important. And within the context of COVID, we have reached very easy agreement between business and labor and this community constituency on issues like the basic income grant, on relief, on health and safety measures in the workplace. There has been an enormous amount of consensus and acknowledgement of the trade-offs that have to be made in the national interest. Chairperson, I hope I've done justice to these challenging questions.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I think you have done sufficient justice. We will continue to engage even beyond during the time when the Civil Society Summit, which was supposed to have happened some time ago, will become the backdrop of this engagement. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And once again, our condolences and hope that the Nedlak staff and community are able to recover to their loss. Let me check. I know we are behind time by about 30 minutes. I'm not sure whether Sibongile is still there. I know she's very pressed with time. She's somewhere in Africa and she needed to go to some classes. If she's available to summarize in the next 10 minutes or so on to catch up your time, please. Sibongile is the executive director of the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa. To preserve your time, you can go ahead. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you very much for the invite and obviously for convening this timeous conversation. So the fragmentation of the legal and policy framework that regulates the sector is something that has been identified as a serious constraint in how civil society is able to organize itself and pursue some of the activities that it wants to undertake. So now there has been a conversation that has been started a long time ago about what it means to have a regulatory framework and what the substance or the core components of that regulatory body is going to look like. I think there has been confirmed by speaker after speaker this morning that a compact that produces a shared vision of how social change comes about is something that we all need to have, because the polarization, so there's fragmentation in the legal and policy framework, and there's also fragmentation in civil society. Whilst this in itself, it's not so concerning, because just like fragmentation and polarization exist in all sectors, of our country, it mirrors what happens in society, at large, whether it's in government, whether it's in business and all of that. There is no sector that is operating kind of coherently. And I think it's something to think about what it means that civil society's fragmentation and polarization is something that is emphasized more than anyone else's. Organizations have a political orientation, and this is really from its core mandate, what it is that they are going to do and how they are going to do it. And unfortunately, in South Africa, this seems to have been narrowed down into two categories: the ones who collaborate with the states and the ones who confront the state. And then later on, I'm going to talk about how this actually narrows our possibility to work together to bring about social change, because when the battle lines are drawn between the collaborative ones and the confrontational ones, it's not about the advocacy itself, whether it's going to be a campaign, whether it's going to be a law reform that's been asked for, or whether people are going to make a decision to go to change, but it is about how people generally see themselves as engaging with the state. When it comes to women's rights, the impact of COVID has just exacerbated the deeply embedded patterns of inequality. We saw the consequences of the hard lockdowns, the informal sector where women are overrepresented. But we have also seen even for people who were fortunate enough to keep their jobs and work from home, how this reinforced existing gender norms and relegated women to stereotypical gender roles. And this is not only in South Africa, but across the globe. It has been observed that COVID has really regressed the fight for gender equality. And we have seen the increased burden on women's unpaid care work that has been brought about by this pandemic. But there were things that happened that we knew but did not expect were going to happen in this way. And I do think that in some ways, COVID became an opportunity to learn and understand or even get proof of things that we wanted to have proof for. The link between alcohol and domestic violence. So as we moved into lockdown, other countries in the world had already had lockdown and they had noticed or observed spike in domestic violence incidents. And South Africa did not exactly follow this pattern, whilst there were more cases, but they didn't go up as they were reported in other countries. And the difference was the alcohol ban between what happened in other countries and what happened in South Africa. And so whether the beneficiary of alcohol bans have been the Department of Health, who are now able to have free beds, or Department of Justice, who don't have offenses committed by people who are under the influence of alcohol, or the sector on gender-based violence and femicide. What we have to record with now is, now that a decisive link has been made, how do we actually continue, and what do we actually do now that this is what we know? And all of these are things that have happened. There's been a lot of conversations on the chat, and I think this is the bigger conversation around how do various sectors hold the state accountable, because accountability is what we seem to struggle with. And it is indeed a great pity that the meaning of accountability has really been shrunk to mean litigation. And in some ways, was one understand how this came about, that we had a time in our country where the executive failed to exercise oversight. The legislature also failed at a number of times, and the courts became the last line of defense. It has also been observed in this meeting how civil society was at the forefront. You know, some of the things that we are seeing in the state capture are some of the things that actually come from efforts of civil society to try and hold the state to account. So there has to be a recognition that when other sectors of society fail, or even other pillars of government fail to do what they are required to do, we may actually end up with litigation, but not because that's where people wanted to start, but because that's the last tool or last line of defense. But I do think that when it comes to accountability, the way in which the gender-based violence and femicide sector has engaged with the government is a model that we can look at. And I think it is important to highlight this because we live in a society that does have a tendency to kind of minimalize or make invisible the intellectual contributions of women and the way in which they have led various struggles. So I am going to talk about something that has been able to produce results and also has been able to build on various stages. And all of this really being foregrounded on the need to hold the state accountable for gender-based violence and femicide. And I'm not saying that these events the changes that we are seeing can be attributed wholly, but it's to be able to show the contribution of trying to organize a sector and a movement that says we are here to hold the state to account for failure to protect women from violence, whether that violence emanate from public or private sources. So if we do remember in 2018, there was a group of women that really inspired this country with this idea of shutting down the country in order to get the state to respond to gender-based violence. The founders of the total shutdown weren't people who were necessarily associated with NGOs, but over time there was a collaboration between the founders, the actors who were there from different capacities to work together to support the march of the total shutdown. The march was not just a march, even though some people would want to call it, but there was a very clear and very deliberate set of demands which were about holding the state accountable to say, this is what you owe us. It was a 24 demands for every year of democracy. This is what we have not been able to get from the state. The 24 demands led to the presidential summit. The presidential summit created a framework and the interim steering committee that helped to develop the national strategic plan on gender-based violence and femicide. And immediately when that happened, civil society took it upon itself to produce 12 weeks of webinars to empower people to know what was in the national strategic plan, and more importantly, what civil society needed to do in order to hold the state accountable for all of those commitments that were made there. When that moved into the interministerial committee that was set up by the National Strategic Plan and also the Department of Women, which is the department that is responsible for some of this work, together with the Department of Justice, things began to fall apart. And it was because there was a movement that had decided to empower itself and maintain vigilance over what government needed to do, that when attempts to deviate from the National Strategic Plan, which mandated a legislative framework for the establishment of a council, there was popular organizing in form of letter writing campaigns, and also engaging the government to say that we will not allow you to set up a body that lacks accountability, but that is not set out in the National Strategic Plan as the way in which we are going to be able to proceed. So I think it is important that when we have conversation about what accountability is, that we actually learn from the sectors who are part of these community constituency on how there have been attempts to try and do that. And we've also seen this from the youth sector. Yesterday was the hearings for the Board of Trustees of the NYDA. And it is important to also record the role of young people who said the first process was flawed and they pushed back against it, and then the process had to be started afresh. So there is a framework that is emerging from various sectors that is saying, we are going to engage you, but we are going to use the tools that are available to us as movements in order to be able to hold you accountable. And so it has been very encouraging to see these various ways in which the state is being held accountable. So what I do think that we need to be able to learn and kind of appreciate is that even when the Department of Women failed with the Department of Justice to start this process, or to engage civil society on the legislative process that was mandated, it was still possible for civil society to work with the presidency in order to get the private sector to launch a fund whilst the other work was still ongoing in other government departments. Now, the women's sector, just like any other sector, is a sector that requires kind of funding in order to be able to do its work. Many speakers before me have spoken about the trust deficit. And and the trust deficit that comes from the rampant mismanagement and corruption that we continue to see. And when this happens, it is very tempting to displace government and civil society to want to assume some of its obligation, whilst other people may say, let's privatize services, other people say, let's give services to NGO. And NGOs do amazing work, but not all NGOs are equally positioned. And we have seen the disaster that can happen when the state decides to also outsource some of its work to civil society without necessarily actually doing due diligence that is required. The Life Esidimeni incident or crisis is something that is going to be a source of shame for attempting to experience in a manner that is so reckless. Now, there has been calls for the type of funding that the sector would need in order to be able to do, its work. But one thing that we cannot deny is that as civil society, we cannot implement at the scale that the state is implementing. And it is important to say, even as we do this work, that this is not work that we should be doing. This is work that belongs to the state, rightfully so, because that's the state obligation. If we come from the Constitution, this is what the state owes us as citizens. So it is important how we have that conversation about why the state must fund civil society, that we recognize that the obligation lies with the state, even though civil society actually does it. In the women's movement, we have called for a barrier-free funding to allow money to flow to communities where this is very much needed. There have been many examples of how women continue to organize in their communities and also to provide vital services, especially in the rural areas where there are lesser registered NGOs, many of them as community-based organizations or voluntary associations. And then over and above this barrier-free funding, there's this idea of participatory grant making, which allow those who are affected to make decisions about where the money should go. And this is why it is important for the sector to actually follow the conversation around the development of the legislative framework, because it is important that these key principles are in the legislation that sets up the council to respond to gender-based violence and femicide. Whilst we agree that civil society organizations must be resilient, we need to push back against this idea that civil society needs to start income generating project in order to be seen as successful or responsible. There are some organizations who can do this, but it is a mistake to say that people who are doing all sorts of other work now have to go and learn business skills so that they can set up income generating project. Funding that people require is funding. It is a resource that enables them to do their work, and we shouldn't stigmatize it by referring to it as handouts. Because if we are to understand the role of civil society, it's that there will be people who come with money and there are people who will come with solutions to the problems that their communities actually face. So in going forward, I think there is no doubt about the role that the sector on women's rights actually play in this country, but it's also important not only to see the sector as providing services, but also to see the sector as a sector that is invested and should legitimately contribute to the conversation around the architecture or the regulation of this sector. So when we talk about this, we have to be very intentional about how the various sectors contribute to all of these structures where people are being asked to be part of civil society. There's always a concern about the quality of civil society's contribution in these processes. And in many ways, I've kind of felt that this is unfair. First of all, you have people who are employed by government, whether they are technical experts who are coming in as a consultant or they work in this sector every day. And you have people who have been asked to represent a sector to come and sit in this meeting without necessarily even an understanding of how government bureaucracy actually works. So if we want civil society to really participate in these processes, we have to be invested, and we have to invest in how we facilitate their participation. Many organizations do not sit with budgets or funding for policy engagement. And so what it means is that people have to leave the work that they are funded to do in order to participate in these meetings. And that's why sometimes there is uneven participation, because we're not talking here about board members. We're talking here about these processes that establishes frameworks or regulatory kind of environments. So I do think that that's also something that we have to think about when we think about what is meaningful participation of civil society in contributing to these conversations. And number two, when we talk about representation, we also need to be clear about what we mean by representation. When we say representation, when someone is a representative of the women's sector, are we talking about someone who happens to come from the women's sector because she is a woman or she does work around the issues? Or are we talking about someone who has a mandate of the sector, who has a responsibility to consult with the sector so that whenever she comes back into these spaces, her views and her contribution is informed? Because what we are finding, and this is something that leads to the polarization, is that whilst people are said to be representing the sector, there's no requirement actually that they must have any relationship or be involved with constituencies that they seek to represent. And most of the time, the constituent or the sector will say, but we did not agree to this. So it is important that when these processes are designed, that these are the things that are actually made very clear, because sometimes the sector would want people to account, but the people would say, you did not send me there. You know, my organization sent me there. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Sibongile. I think it was comprehensive, especially the lessons that we are learning from the total shutdown, but also a critical reflection that we as civil society also must do a self-introspection in order to appreciate our fundamental role and responsibilities vis-a-vis the state, as well as our own internal capability of being able to do certain things and at what scale, and perhaps what is needed for us to be able to refine and reflect on what we need to do and what we can do. Thank you very much. I know that you are pressed with time, but I've also checked on the chat, and I think people have listened to your need to rush away. And there is only one question from the Q&A, which says, Bongile, what is your take on the relation between structured civil society, i.e. registered NPOs and CSOs, and the independent social movements such as UPM, Abahlali Basem, John Dolo, etc., etc.? That is one question that you have from the chat. I can see is the same question. Sibongile?
A few people,
you have muted.
Yes, a few people I think before me have talked about the need for strategic kind of collaborations between civil society. And when you think about these relationships where between social movements, and we have seen kind of productive partnerships in civil societies where people who organize themselves sometimes it can just be a simple issue of fiscal hosting. For example, when organizations or social movements that are not registered are able to go to a registered organization to say, look, we have funding sources, but this is what is required for the money to come to us. And then can you be our fiscal host? But sometimes these are relationships that have been about supporting the strategic coherence of social movements without necessarily trying to divert them, from their goals, because sometimes the struggle there could be social movements or organizations that are registered because they have things that they need to comply with, may not necessarily kind of work with social movements in ways which are productive. And so sometimes they may de-radicalize them because then they have to say, we can do this, we cannot do this. And we see this a lot in the women's movement, where a social movement of people who come from various directions, or people who are saying we are organizing ourselves or organizing a march. And people are saying, look, we have gone, we have sought the permit, this is what they have said we need to do. But other people say, you know what, if we want to engage in direct action like civil disobedience, you cannot police how we express our rage. And you've got the organizers, of the meeting completely like not knowing what to do, because here you have a social movement, but you have an NGO that says, if anything goes wrong, our organization is going to be held accountable. So I do think that once again, from the beginning, I think when we're talking about a social compact, the same principles applies to strategic collaborations. What do we have a shared vision of social change? Are we clear about what our roles should be? So as a host organization or as a strategic partner, what is it that you want to do, and what is it that you want us to support with? Are there areas of convergence, but are there areas of divergence? And so how do we kind of mitigate against all of those things that may lead to tension? And I think we have seen a lot of these things, and we can even preempt where things go wrong, because we have seen how these relationships happen or do not work out in the past. And I do think that we have to be a sector that really, if not iterative in terms of just doing things over and over again and trying to be better, that we can actually record the key lessons of what went right, but also what went wrong.
Thank you very much, Sibongile. And when you come back, we will continue to engage for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, bye.
Yes. Can we then quickly move to our last speaker in terms of contribution before we go into the research report? I will call on Bonginkosi Nkosi, who's the board secretary of the Southern African Youth Association, Southern African Association of Youth Clubs. Bonginkosi?
Thank you, Chairperson. My camera is on. Well, taking from what the latter speakers has been related, well, mine will be on the basis of the youth challenge, on the question of the untapped energy of young people, particularly in South Africa. Well, as an organization that has existed for the past 80 plus years, one of the things that of late that we've attributed to the untapped energy of young people currently in South Africa would be that South Africa possesses a significant number of an assertive, strong young generation who are able to contribute and lead change. I'm a bit of challenged with the allowing the start video.
Okay, mute your video. Switch off your video.
Okay. I've tried that. There's nothing happening on my device.
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. As I was saying that South Africa possesses a great number or a significant number of assertive, strong young generation who are able to contribute and lead change in the face of the emerging global challenges to build a better and a stronger South Africa and Africa in general. However, while most young South Africans are optimistic about the future, those feeling very positive about the future have decreased greatly each year. Africa needs to empower its young people, and South Africa in particular, to increase their ability to personally influence what is happening in their lives and communities. Involve youth in government decisions, making processes, which includes involving young people in the planning and delivery of services that interest and impact upon them. Equipping young people with skills so they can increasingly contribute to decision making and instigate matters for government consideration, thereby creating the opportunity for young people to become more involved. One of the leading civil society organizations, we also believe that to meet South Africa's challenges head on, we need a generation of groundbreaking and adaptable young people to create their future. Thus, our motto stands that young people living their dreams. If we give the youth an opportunity, the future is going to look very different from what we have today. Young people are not a problem to be helped or solved. They are the conduits of creativity and catalyst for change. Young people are ambitious, creative, and capable of rethinking the world and solving tomorrow's problems today. With young people, the world of work is changing because young people are enterprising. Young people can lead social action with a social conscience that will let them build a better world in the process. If all this happens, we will value diversity as youth participation and engagement processes will be creative, flexible, and inclusive of young people's diversity. This diversity includes cultural and linguistic background, gender, life experience, viewpoints, age, health, and well-being. Location, class, disability, spiritual engagement as participation, meaningful experience which acknowledges young people's input and contributions. Then only the freedom of young people to comment, provide advice, and participate be respected and fostered by government and governments across, especially in the southern or in SADC. Young people are valuable members of the African community and make significant contributions to community life. Government policies have a significant impact on young people's lives, and accordingly, young people are entitled to have their voice heard in public policy making. Young people's participation in decision making provides opportunities for them to influence or have their say on issues of important on our introduction on the
There's a difficulty with your
joblessness and thus far, and we. Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yeah, try. There is a challenge with your audio.
Okay. Can you hear me well now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. we're of the view that South Africa consists of a great significant number of young people populace. Therefore, it is very important that when government does policies, it is very important that this greater portion of our populace is properly consulted and is also allowed to have input in such issues. It is also very important that when we as the civil society design programs and strive to do community work or actually civil society work, it is important that also in our governing bodies, that the voice of young people is also present. Because we have seen that in many of our civil society, including the government itself, many of the decision makers are predominantly old people, and which then creates a distance or a gap between those that are set to benefit from the intended programs. It is also important that when we move forward as a country, and also considering the current crises that we are facing in relation to the question of the COVID-19, it is important that the value of young people in our community is demonstrated by their input and by their activeness in terms of providing leadership and also again execution of the many programs that are intended to address the issues that are on the ground. But Chair, I won't be too long. For me, it is important that young people in South Africa in particular today cannot look forward to living an independent and fulfilling life. Their future remains precarious. Young people have been hit hard by the crisis over crisis. For a large number of them, the transition from education to employment has become more difficult. Too many are at risk of poverty or exclusion. Many feel that their views are taken for granted and their best use is being political stooges. There is a serious risk that a large number will drift away from society. This is very much unacceptable. We need to do much more to support young people, and youth work can play a vital role in this as we pursue the future. Chair, I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Bonginkosi. I have checked in the questions and queue. I hope people need a short break. There are no specific questions on the chat. Yeah, there are no specific questions in the chat. Thank you very much. I am reminding colleagues to remember the Menti Meter on your chat box so that we can comprehensively pull together what we view of what needs to happen for the sector going forward. I want to quickly take the last presentation from Fragmentis, which is the most critical one as well, in terms of the studies that the Kagiso Trust has done on the community and civil society resilience, as well as the issue paper, position paper that came out of the study. Frank?
Thank you. Thanks, Abi. Thanks, everyone. We're going to focus in this talk on two aspects, one of them being the survey that was conducted, and the second, we're going to look at the issues paper, which drew on a wider range of activities undertaken last year. So we've got that up. Let's see if we can get it full screen. So in 2020, during last year, these processes were part of the responses of Kagiso Trust. So in those responses, it was part of the organization's contribution to the national effort, but also accompanied by the commitment to supporting civil society. So I'm just checking if we are still live. So let's continue with the input around the food relief patients within civil society that we surveyed were involved in that. The organizations were also involved in health and sanitation issues. And then thirdly, organizations were involved in the issue of shelter. At a much broader level, there were some other areas of involvement, for example, in education. So the organizations also gave us a lot of feedback about various aspects of their work during the COVID-19. One aspect that they also gave us feedback on was on the issue of funding. What was interesting was that half of the organizations were able to access funding. Local groups, individuals were not so successful in accessing funding. Individuals and local groups got their funding, interestingly, mainly from individual donors, local businesses, but also family members. So what COVID-19 showed us was that there's immense potential for resource contributions for our communities, even though we have such widespread poverty in South Africa. We also asked organizations during the survey what their views are about how civil society should organize itself to amplify its voice. And 63% of organizations mentioned the idea of collaboration and coordination. Most of them said that formalized network bodies are much more impactful in terms of voicing community needs. If you add 8% that also mentioned and emphasized the idea of sector-based clusters, that's 71%. So this need for coordination emerged as a very big need. From the side of the NPOs, a big issue for them was the issue of capacity and training to more effectively engage. Organizations were asked about future issues, and virtually all of them responded that they saw that the issues coming towards us post-COVID was heightened poverty and unemployment and a deepening of inequality. They saw the importance of supporting demands for an economic stimulus, campaigns around data access, as well as a range of other kinds of restructuring related to communities' own ability to become self-sufficient through co-ops, as well as through, for example, changes in the whole food system. There were also many comments and feedback around ways of actually increasing youth access to jobs, employment, and involvement in society. The issue of food, aside from the issue of changing the food systems, but direct provision of food was much more prominent among individuals and small groups. A second major issue for organizations was trauma, the issues of GBV and youth, and the entire question of how society is going to address the needs of vulnerable groups post-COVID. Then organizations mentioned their own internal issues of being able to adapt to the new normal, working smart, leveraging tech opportunities, and being able to adapt and adopt entrepreneurial skills so that they were able to help communities. Let's move on to the question that we posed to organizations about the strategic questions going forward in South Africa. Again, those are set out there: economic restructuring, including support for community systems for survival, as well as changes to food systems, jobs, food. This is, I suppose, direct food relief, issues around the vulnerable being made more vulnerable, and corruption, service delivery, and accountability in relation to that. There were some policy considerations that organizations mentioned in responding to the survey. There are just three which came out prominently. One is organizations kept highlighting which priority areas government should invest significantly more in. The second one is quite important. Organizations want to see government engaged much more in order to use their expertise, in order to define the focus, refine the needs, and fast-track services. That issue was mentioned by the speaker from Nedlak. And thirdly, organizations have emphasized that we should use what we learned during the pandemic in order to change the whole approach to disaster management and find ways of getting resources through to civil society organizations more effectively and much faster. Before I move on to the issues paper, I want to mention that the organizations did highlight a number of issues related to government's response and the deficiencies there. So although government did take the lead and mobilize a huge amount of resources, there were a whole range of gaps, difficult to contact government, little responses from government, communication problems with government, and some of those are still continuing to the present. Let's go on to the issues that came up in the issues paper. So we crafted an issues paper that examined the whole range of questions that came from both the survey as well as the consultations we had with organizations, as well as a study undertaken by Kagiso Trust, I think in 2019, the typology study. The background in the issues paper is one I think which we're all familiar with, 1994, great optimism. Then major improvements, people having access to a huge system of rights, social grants in place. But of course, those huge areas where in fact the promise of the transition was not met, was not fulfilled, the deepening of inequality and poverty. Business has a view of that, and they talk about the way in which the transition has not led to economic growth. But civil society has a different take and would emphasize redistribution and the way in which our changes have been inadequate in addressing our social and economic challenges. So looking ahead, we can see that a key question going forward from this pandemic and looking at how we build the recovery is whether all sectors are willing to openly discuss ways in which we move forward, ways in which we plan and execute the recovery, but in a manner that we address the society's fault lines. So not just addressing A, the health question, and B, there's this question of sort of getting the economy to function just in the manner that it had functioned before February and March 2020, but how to actually recover in such a manner that we address the fault lines. And the key question is how we're going to, as sectors, work together to tackle that recovery. And the key point that we make in the issues paper is that the social sector, as we heard earlier, is the Cinderella, is not taken seriously in the planning. We should just flag that there has been substantial government response in relation to COVID-19, from the leadership to the top, the support to the frontline workers, and we can see it feeding through all the way through some relief efforts and now through the vaccine issue. So problems of effectiveness and malfeasance and corruption notwithstanding, there was a response on scale which led to the prioritization of government budgets. Let's look at, in this issues paper, how we examine the impacts on the community. So the first and most prominent at the time last year when we did this was the huge impacts in terms of food security and hunger. So much so that there were protests in many places. Other issues that really impacted communities severely included the education issue and the deepening of inequality in education. We've seen that how certain vulnerable populations were affected by the closure of the health institutions and the focus on COVID-19. In the uneven health services in general, violence against women and girls, and then very centrally, people living in informal settlements bore the brunt. Their living conditions meant they often couldn't comply with what was required. And like I mentioned earlier, there were huge gaps in government's response, lack of coordination in government departments, closed offices. Many people working at local level often wondered where were the representatives of local government, where were the councillors, communication issues, delays in payment, and then many organizations wrote to government offering to assist. But according to the feedback we got in the survey, many didn't get replies. On the food security, the research we did showed that NGOs were responsible for delivering anything up to 50% of all food parcels. The organization Ask Africa says that a combination of food parcels from business and NGOs constitute about 50%, and the rest came from government. So the NPOs displayed an incredible agility and ability to bounce back and respond. Most of them said they could have done much more, but they were not given the resources to do so. So they were hugely underutilized. Let's go to the priority issues quickly. During the compiling of the issues paper, we looked at what were the priority issues that were mentioned, and we came up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 7. And you can see them: the economy, jobs, livelihoods, social security on many levels, and a huge demand that the unions have also taken up to expand the basic income grant. Issue of data and connectivity, addressing gender-based violence, the relationship between the governed and government, huge gaps there, and then combating corruption, and then ways to, even though youth were in many cases not top of mind during the way in which the pandemic rolled out, but the deepening of poverty, the deepening of inequality meant that that problem of the exclusion of youth is going to bounce back in a major way going forward. So with regard to civil society, and this is, I guess, the penultimate point I'll be making in this presentation, we need to focus on the need for strengthening as an urgent priority, both community-based organizations, the communities, as well as NGOs have taken a hammering as a result of, I suppose, all the changes and the impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic. So in the partnership, the question is, how will we be able to strengthen the sector to play its role alongside the other sectors? When we asked organizations how did they think their work would change going forward, many mentioned that they thought they would be doing much more community mobilization. A huge number said they would be doing increased levels of advocacy on issues coming up during COVID-19. And many more said that even though some may not have been doing so before, that they would be participating to a greater extent in national networks. Big question there is, have those materialized? We are now months after this research work was done, and it would be interesting to see whether those things have materialized. We asked organizations and also used other means to look at what the sector said it needed for its own strengthening, so greater coordination in its own ranks, better engagement with government, and better government relationships, partnering, communication, a whole range of things about that has been highlighted as being weak. Issue of technology has also come up as a key thing. Organizations need to pivot to use technology much more. And then the proper resourcing to NPOs. These are the small organizations in the different provinces during a crisis and beyond. On this issue of the platforms for engagement, from many perspectives, it is seen as important, as we've heard. Government needs it. We want to mobilize the contribution of all sectors. We want to find ways to help NPOs in smaller provinces. And if we are coordinated, we can actually provide the training and other support that's needed by the smaller NPOs that forms part of this huge base of civil society in South Africa. And then organizations, and I think all of us as South Africans genuinely want to see the sector having greater strength in order to push the transformation agenda. So lastly, the issues paper highlights just a few way forward suggestions. So under the political, there is the recommendation that all plans for reconstruction and recovery should be intertwined with this whole idea that we must get back to and continue to heal the divisions of society. We cannot recover without doing that. We should recognize that governance requires interdependence. That's under the political level. Under the economic level, the issues paper makes this suggestion that rather than restrict the fiscal space in this time, we need a huge stimulus injection, and this is supported by actions taken in other countries and also on the advice of the UN. And we also need to remember that we should stimulate livelihood activities, self-sufficiency activities at community-based level. On the social level, we've got to maintain that focus on addressing issues of hunger and poverty, immediate needs facing community. Continue to take action on this commitment that many sectors have made about expanding the basic income grant and then scaling up our resources to deal with violence against women. So lastly, as we conclude with this paper, we can see that COVID-19 has been devastating on us at every level, households, businesses, and community, but it has also brought about resilience, cohesion, unlocked many capacities that we sometimes have forgotten about. In looking ahead and based on the work of the survey and all the consultations we did, we want to say, how can we move forward in a way that does not reverse the gains we have made in addressing the SDGs? Those are the Sustainable Development Goals, and addressing issues that are raised in the National Development Plan. But we do it in such a way that we continue the momentum on those issues, addressing those huge cracks in our society. So there are immense opportunities for us all to work together much better to find solutions. Can we do so? I'll end there. So back to you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Frank. I think it is fairly detailed reports. There are about 8 of them. And then we will share or advise people where to access them in the, can you hear me? Yeah, thanks very much, Frank. I think it was a very, the research product has about 8 reports. And then we have already shared 3 of those. And then the rest will advise when we send out the report to colleagues where to locate them through our system. Just very briefly, and because the time is not very good with us at this point in time, but we are still within that time framework. There are not much. We will also share the presentations with the participants. I think a very few questions, Frank, at this point in time. One is from Lena Farret. You can read the questions. You don't have to answer all of them, but they are very specific and most of them very contextual. There is another question from, that one was the audibility issue. Do you have 2 minutes to respond to Glenn, Frank?
Thanks, thank you. So, yeah, these are key questions I think that we are all grappling with. What are those spaces for us to organize and to engage, and whether we need some forms of national development forums, whether we need platforms with government to better engage. And I think what we should do is always to separate such forums from funding, so that in fact organizations can have that independence when they raise their voice, when they speak on behalf or with communities. And so I think in all among all the speakers, that issue has been raised about a platform to engage in an ongoing, standing and sustainable way with government to review the way in which the partners are working together. That is government as a sector, as well as civil society. In putting together such a structure, the focus in such engagements must always be strategically very clear. The focus needs to always be on the extent, in my view, to which we are addressing the developmental challenges, and particularly the circumstances facing the communities throughout South Africa, the young people, the critical issues facing women. And you know, even though other issues might arise, for example, the statutory framework, the enabling environment for organizations, the main focus has to be how do we use the voice of civil society organizations? How do we hear the voices of communities in order to advance the transformation of South Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. We do not have more questions, and I think the colleagues have the reports and the presentation will be shared as a basis for our ongoing engagement. As we said, this represents the basis from which we start the journey of exploring some of the key challenges that we are facing, as been highlighted by the various studies, which we will be able to do over the next few years. At this point in time, I would like to Mitesh, are you ready just to flight and share the outcome of the Menti Meter? As we have been engaging, I'm not going to read them because they will also be part of the report that we will produce. Mitesh, are you ready? I think your colleagues can be able to read them themselves. They are moving very slowly.
I think that covers all of them.
I think there are a great number of them ranging from national intervention to provincial level and to the municipal level. And also they call for mechanism for civil society to reorganize themselves, create sufficient and efficient platforms from which it can engage with itself and others, and also develop some key common consensus and reflection on its own strategic approaches, its own vision and its collaborative mechanism, so that primarily, as per the outcome, some of the key questions that we will have to explore going forward is to ensure that the strategic contribution of civil society's ability to engage with the government is not dependent on the government, but is designed and strengthened by civil society itself as a starting point. So that, these are the very critical points of departure that have been highlighted from the Menti Meter, which we will build on as we go forward. We will share them as part of the report that we'll share within the coming week, at the very least. I think at this point in time, we just need to take about 15-20 minutes as civil society now, having listened to the expert contributions, the expert presentations, some of the key questions raised. And from what we have said in the Menti Meter and the outcome of the Kagiso Trust research, we need to open up now to look into what do we think, where do we think we want to go from here in terms of the general open discussions. I want to open it now for the contributions from the participants. And I think we can do that either by show of hands or through the chat box and the Q&A. We will take the next 20 minutes just to get the feeling of where do we think we are and where do we think we want to go and how we want to get there. The platform is open for engagement, interaction. You can do so by either raising the hand or through the various chats. Can you see the hands? Sorry, I'm battling with the hands here. Let me go to them. We have two hands. Let's start with Philip, and then followed by Philip Mechanic, and then followed by Glenn Farrett.
Hi, hello. Thank you, if I may go now. Thank you for facilitating this. And I'm in Makana, as you picked up from the earlier questioning. One of our big challenges here is government is extremely negative.
Can you unmute Philip?
I should be unmuted.
Philip, go ahead. Philip, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
What is the problem?
Yeah. So anyway, let me know if you can't hear me because it shows that I'm not muted on the side. I am from Makana, as you picked up from earlier questions. One of the big challenges we have in civil society when it comes to issues of service delivery is government is extremely defensive and sees us as adversaries, rather than that if we are picking up problems and proposing solutions, that we're actually helping them to do our job. So I'd be interested to hear from the panel on good ideas of how to turn around that attitude from government, particularly when there is so much government and failure and dysfunction. Thanks.
Thanks, Philip. Glenn? Glenn? Huh? Is what? Glenn, are you there? Can you hear me? Okay, on. Unmute, please.
Hi, Abby, thanks for the invitation, although, but I hadn't put my hand up. But maybe since you've invited me to intervene, just following on from Philip's input, I've noticed this morning that that the local government in Makanda has actually issued an interdict against the unemployed people's movement in Makanda, who was one of the social movements who was playing quite a constructive role in what was happening in Makanda, and the really disruptive elements like the taxi industry, they have not interdicted. So, you know, I think that Philip's question comes from the kind of frustration when the local government kind of criminalizes what's quite a sort of democratic grassroots movement instead of the actual, you know, disruptive elements that are creating much more sort of havoc and destruction of property, etc.
Thank you very much. Let us engage colleagues across the board because the questions are not necessarily directed to us. I saw a hand which has disappeared. I can't see it anymore. Len, are you back? I can't see any hand. No? Len, are you back? Yeah, he has disappeared. Any other comments? There is nothing on the Q&A. Oh, Len is unable to speak for some reason. Has he been unmuted, Len Faret?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh, so I think firstly, to all the panelists and for all the work that has been done, I think we must extend enormous debt of gratitude to the researchers and Kagiso Trust and the participants on the panel. I think it's been most enlightening and useful for us all. And I think that I hope that a concrete recommendation may be that you will continue this as a series of discussions to take forward, rather than for us to gather and dissipate again. Because I think unless there's a convening point, a focal point to which we can return to unpack the rich detail of the information which has been gathered and presented and the debates which have arisen, I think it would be very useful for all of us to benefit from a series of ongoing engagements, which I'm sure you have already planned. I think to the panel, there is an underlying problem which I think runs through much of what has been discussed, and that is that if we go back to the Swilling study, the conceptualization of the sector and its complexity, I think, has long been known to us. Then these supposed dichotomies between constructive and adversarial relations between state and government are also themes that have been explored or articulated over a very long period of time. In the sort of national level discourse, what we have, I think, which I'm not sure to what extent this has come out clearly, is a legislative framework and policy framework which was anchored in an historical moment around the Reconstruction and Development Program post-1994. I'm sure the chairperson and Frank in particular are aware of that. There are a number of key assumptions which were made at the time about how the relationship between state and civil society would unfold. The reality of the post-apartheid era has reflected that those assumptions have not held. My central question is this: at what point do we revisit the framework of legislation regarding civil society? We cannot persist in reinventing state-centric solutions. That does not imply that we do not require structured relations with the state. But the assumption that is in the Non-Profit Organizations Act, the Npo Act, and its related arrangements are that these things, that there is what I think John Chitenze referred to earlier on as this common developmental transformation agenda. Now, it is clear that we don't have that. It is also clear that the capabilities and limitations of the state have been exposed. And the relations between civil society and the state are a reflection of those broader contestations. What is the prospect of reviewing with an eye to renew that entire framework? The Npo Act clearly is ineffective. What prospect is there for civil society to be able to gather its experience together into a new framework? And what is the likelihood of that? And what do you think the key innovations need to be that should be put in place? And these relate particularly to the question of resourcing the non-profit sector. What other options are available? What mechanisms may be brought into place? And how does that happen? I think a related subsidiary point is the persistent illusion that the Department of Social Development has the efficiencies to act as a regulatory support body. Clearly, that practice has shown us that that is not the case. What other options exist to create a focal point between the state and non-state actors? Now, not speaking about Nedlak, but for a new legislative and policy framework for NGOs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn. I think you have summarized some of the key features of the threads of the presentations and the outcome. And also, given that we have committed to finish at 1 o'clock, I don't see any other hands on the chat on the Q&A. And also, I think some of the key issues before I summarize, or the key issues that they are emerging that we seem to be committing to take forward. I think one of them is that we really need to deeply look into the state civil society relations and engagement, and to determine profoundly what character and shape it should take. What will be the influencing forces and capability of civil society to make sure that that state relationship or the various social compacts can be driven through it. The second issue which is emerging is the issue of the strength of civil society and its capacity to engage with these processes more effectively. And I think it's an area that we need to collectively explore, shape, and determine its key features and elements. Along with it, it's a resourcing for the sector. Is there a sufficient national framework in which the sector can be resourced, supported, to ensure that it plays its key particular role without being consumed by some other constraining factors that comes out with the funding of whatever form or who? The third issue which is emerging is an issue of, do we generate sufficient information and knowledge that will inform us to re-architecture the policy framework and the content? And I think that is going to be very critical in terms of some of the emerging issues, so that we go back to the drawing boards, re-understand some of the evolutions in the state of our country and civil society at this very particular point, in order for us to re-elevate its capabilities and capacities going forward. The other issue seems to be saying we need to look into the coordination, collaboration, and partnerships within civil society, but also appreciate the various inequalities, so to speak, within the sector itself, the community-based organizations, the social movements, and so on. How do we create a mediated understanding that will enable the sector to begin to move as a cohesive and collaborative force. Is one of the things that we need to do. And in particular, which is coming and relating to research as well, is the kind of changes that we require nationally, having learned from COVID-19 impact, but also the policy architecture as to whether it's still responsive to the needs of social transformation. So that if we intervene there, one, we have sufficient information, and secondly, that we are able to collaboratively work together. The other issue which is emerging is how do we sustain these processes of engagement, of discussions, and so on. And that we should try to find a way of continuing a series of dialogues and discussions, perhaps start moving to the sectoral engagements so that we firm up concretely the kind of issues that we want to engage with, and creating some sort of civil society focal engagement points so that we are able to coordinate ourselves, but also respond to some of the challenges that we are facing. And finally, one of the philosophical but also concrete theoretical issues is, can we develop a common developmental agenda and transformation framework that we can broadly agree to as a defining niche for civil society to move coherently together forward? Those are some of the key emerging issues that I think are emerging from the discussions that we have had so far. And I hope that I'm summarizing them coherently and cogently. And because we are nearing the closure now, I am going to ask Frankie very briefly to confirm that my summation is correct. And Joel, are you still there? I want to put you on the spot. Joel, are you still there?
No, yes, I'm still here.
Because I think some of the key summation of issues that are coming up are essentially also hinged on your presentation. If you are able to reframe and suss out what exactly do you think what is being suggested, and if it's doable in about 5 minutes.
If you were to ask me how we should take forward the discussions from today's interaction, I would say that using the research work that was done before the webinar, as well as the various ideas that have emerged from here, there should be a brief report that looks into the environment in which we are very briefly, but more importantly, on the role that civil society can play to take the country to a higher trajectory of growth and development. That maybe can then serve as a basis for consultation amongst all the stakeholders, those who were present here, as well as all the others. And I would argue that this should involve the NPOs, the formal ones, as well as the civil society organizations that campaign around specific issues. This should include proposals on how to ensure adequate and fair representation at Nedlak, and how to expand what is currently referred to as the community sector in that representation. It should also include the kind of interactions that should take place in civil society, including NPOs, outside of Nedlak on a regular basis. And on the basis of all that, perhaps a proposal or a conference with a proposal on the way forward can then be decided upon. This should include campaigns that challenge wrong things that are happening in society and within government, but also what supportive actions can be undertaken to strengthen the good things that are happening, so that what we have is a combination of cooperation and contestation amongst the social partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Joel. I think you have succinctly summarized it in the context of the key discussions and the outcome. What will happen is that we will be able to pull all of these things together. Within the next 7 days, we should be able to share the key summary of the seminar so that we keep and begin the process of engaging each other. And during that period also we'll spend the time digesting the recommendations, the outcomes. And I think during the course of July, we should be able to begin a process of engaging each other, and especially on some of the things. And I think Comrade Joel Netisenze has summarized some of the key features of the way forward, so that the civil society can begin to resuscitate its strategic role of going forward. Thank you very much, Comrade. And I think there were also a wealth of contributions from the Menti Meter, and those will also find their space in the report that will be shared in the coming 7 days to ensure that we don't lose anything and we don't leave any contribution behind. Thank you very much. And before I leave, I lose the participants because the time is about for us to come to close. I would like then to call on the Chief Executive Officer, the Chief Operating Officer of Kagiso Trust, Mr. Themba Mola, to provide us with the closing remarks. And from myself, thank you very much until we re-engage again. Thank you. Themba?
Thank you, Chair. And let me start by really appreciating how the webinar went and a lot of hard work that contributed to its success. I am looking forward to a program that you will share with us on how we are going to carry forward the conversation. Suffice to mention that Kagiso Trust recognizes the role of the civil society organization, including the Npo sector, as an important role player in complementing government and in striving to strengthen a democratic, prosperous, and a society that is inclusive for all. This understanding has been affirmed today, I think you would agree, by the deliberations of the webinar. Through this webinar, we have sought to reimagine the future and the role of the NPO sector, given the South African challenges, including inequality as expressed, poverty, unemployment, service delivery, corruption, and I dare say rampant corruption, gender-based violence, food insecurity, and the digital divide. To some extent, I mean, Joel's comment to say that I also personally do note that there are other entities that would have loved to join this conversation, but because of those constraints as mentioned, they were unable to do that. So maybe the challenge is then to say, how else can we access these platforms and access these other people that may not have had an opportunity to participate in today's conversation. This webinar was therefore well timed as a response to the need to find convergence between the NPO sector and government. I also noted that the social compacting is not just an easy process. It must be thought through. Discussions within the NPO sector using the expert contributions that were made today, discussions on the community resilience survey and the typology study as it was presented. The webinar has succeeded in focusing our attention on the immediate challenges and understand a new sense of agency triggered not only by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also by the persistent fault lines of poverty and inequality as a starting point for our action plans. On behalf of Kagiso Trust, I would like to thank speakers and all the participants for honoring the invitation and for the contributions. Kagiso Trust is committed to facilitate the realization of the webinar outcomes through leveraging our collective resources to ensure civil society plays its role effectively. This will only be possible through collaborative partnerships supported by coordination within the NPO sector itself. This webinar also foregrounds our 5-year strategic plan starting in July 2021 to June 2026. We therefore invite you that you walk along each other during this journey over the next 5 years and beyond. Let me also thank everyone who logged into the webinar from morning until now. Thank you very much, Chair. Over back to you.
Thank you very much, Emma. I think we have now come to the closure. I invite everybody for lunch. Have a beautiful lunch that will energize our resolve to move forward collectively. Thank you very much and appreciate it. Until next time. Thank you.